and this is Tanya, and we are here today interviewing Harvey Smith. He's my father, for those of you who already don't know me. And we're going to be talking about his life and experiences in a culturally diverse world and in civil rights and social justice activism. But first, I would like to just say one thing. This morning, as most of you know already, Edward Snowden has left the transit area of the Moscow airport for the first time since June 23rd, and is now free to move about the country. So I wanted to give a good shout out to Edward and tell him good luck and Godspeed.
Yes.
And thank you very much to the Russian government for doing the right thing and not bowing under the pressure of the American terrorist organization that we like to refer to as the United States government. So, go Edward.
Yes, and I'd just like to say thank you, Edward, for the risk that you have done for making us, the American people, aware. So thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Harvey is 63 years old and grew up in New York City, where there was just a melting pot of cultural diversity, from cultures, races, religions, all of it. So we're going to ask him to tell us about that.
Okay, I grew up, born in 1950 in New York City. Grew up in a housing project which was multicultural, multiracial. As a child, though, you don't think of it like that. You just think of, this is life, this is what it is. We had neighbors who were black, we had neighbors who were white, we had neighbors who were Latino. Being Jewish was a largely Jewish population. We went to school. It was integrated. We knew nothing about segregation. Went to summer camp, a Jewish summer camp, and the funny thing I remember was that was during the time in the late 50s, early 60s at the Jewish day camp. Most of the counselors were black. At the time, there was great affinity, and I'm sure it is now, about the Jewish and the black communities. I guess because maybe the history of oppression and what went on, and the civil rights movement. Same thing in 1960, I went to a summer camp, a Jewish summer camp. The funny thing is, half the counselors were black, half the counselors were white, and there was black and white children going there. So growing up, I had black friends, white friends, and we never thought of anything out of the usual. In fact, there was a lady next door in the apartment we lived in it was a housing project, a city-owned housing project for working class people. The lady next door, who was black, took us under, I guess, her wing as a grandmotherly figure, her and her husband, and we would have them over for dinners or Thanksgiving. Come to find out, she told me later before we moved out of the project that she grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. At the age of 14, they got married, but what was happening down south, they became part of the black diaspora, who went up north and became part of the culture up north.
And the funny thing is, Rocky Mount was the first place we moved to when we left New York.
Yeah, it's almost like deja vu.
So there was no black, white water fountains, no segregated
No,
lunch counters.
no, there was no such thing. Now, let me be perfectly clear. In New York, like everyone else part of the country, there was racism. Blacks, Jews, and others were kept from certain jobs. The telephone company, New York Bell, didn't hire Jews, didn't hire blacks. There were certain neighborhoods that you couldn't live in if you were anything like white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. There was racism. It wasn't a bowl of cherries and this was utopia. But on the surface anyway, there was no overt racism growing up. When I went to schools, most of my teachers were black and white kids again. When it became time for me to get a summer job, I was 16. I worked in the black neighborhood because my father was a manager at a store there, and it was predominantly black neighborhood. I traveled an hour and a half each day to get to work. I was never afraid. I had black friends there, white friends. It was normal. I never felt the fear that other people felt with this.
But if you were down south during that time, that
Yeah,
would be
and I
a
did,
possibility.
and I didn't know. I did become aware of what was going on in the world in the 1960s, early 1960s, 63, I believe, and that was the Summer of Freedom Summer. Going to public school in New York was a great experience because a lot of progressive people were there. And they would teach us about the Freedom Summer. We had people come in and talk to us who participated in Freedom Summers down south. So the consciousness was raised even more, what was going on in the rest of the country. Up until then, my worldview was the whole United States was New York, which, come to find out, it wasn't. Unfortunately is right. When I was 16, we took a trip down to Florida. Big thing. Got a
This
new
with
car.
Grandma and Grandpa?
My mother and father and my brother, we got in the car and we drove down, and we're going through the South. First time been down south. Coming through North Carolina on 301, seeing the poverty. I didn't know who lived in there, in the houses. But then seeing motels having colored only, or restaurants colored only. It was a real culture shock to see that, because I didn't believe. You read about it, but until you see it, you know. And I could only imagine being a person of color having to live in that situation.
What did Grandma and Grandpa feel about that when they saw those things? Were they shocked also, or?
I think my father knew. My father grew up in Texas, up until mid-30s, so he knew what it was about. And that's a strange thing with my father. My father, and our friends and the family friends, there were some Jewish people, but when someone of color moved in, my father became friends with them and family with them, like someone from the islands or something like that. My father felt an affinity with working, I guess, he didn't say working class people, but that's who he felt affinity for. Didn't matter what color you were. You know, my mother didn't say too much. I never remember my mother saying anything about that at all. You know, that was just a shock all the way from North Carolina, Virginia to Florida, seeing this. And this was coming into the age, this is just before the Martin Luther King had really pushed a lot of these bills through, and Johnson signed them. So this was a turbulent time. This was a real turbulent time. I remember when I turned 18, and that was a really terrible year. We had moved out to Long Island. I was the only Jewish kid in the high school, and there was only another black person in the whole high school. And that was a little bit of culture shock, because then I started seeing the differences, the differences in the kind of segregation, or, okay, it's true that there was no black people living out there on Long Island, but I started questioning why. It became an economic thing too, not just a racial thing, an economic. Why did it keep certain groups out there? And that was the year that Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed, and Martin Luther King was shot and killed. And it was a really terrible, terrible time.
And not much had really changed in Long Island at that point, because I only remember one black student. And I mean, I was just there from kindergarten to 4th grade. But there was only one black student that I can recall.
Yeah.
So I guess it didn't change too much.
It didn't change too much, and looking back on it now, the town where you grew up in and we lived, Farmingville, was about 10, 15 years ago, they had the protests. It was a semi-planned thing because of the immigrants, to keep the immigrants was in my later teens, I didn't realize such things existed. You know, people would tell me, but, and I still call my grandmother Mrs. Evans. We always used to address our elders by Mr. and Mrs. There was no first names. She didn't go into it, but I always wondered why they left North Carolina, as did many other